Without further ado, I would very much like to welcome to the platform our first speaker today, and that is Jeremy Crook OBE. And Jeremy is the CEO of the Black Training and Enterprise Group and is a member of the government's Apprenticeship, Equality and Diversity Advisory Group. Please welcome Jeremy.
Thank you. Okay, cool. Right. Well, morning, everyone. It's great to be in this wonderful venue. My first time here, hoping not the last. This is a really important event as far as I'm concerned. I'm sure there'll be some people in the room who've been on this journey for many, many years. I started out in the kind of early 80s trying to make sure that with government-sponsored training programs, initiatives, there was inclusivity and equality for all young people in particular. And it's been a journey through the techs, the LSCs, and to where we are today with things being employer-led, employer-driven. But we still have the challenges around diversity and inclusion and equality for certain groups within our workforce. I chair the department's E&D advisory group. I don't get paid for it, unfortunately. I think they should pay me, though. We're a small charity surviving like all small charities. But I do it because I think we want to make sure the department gets as much external support, advice on how to find practical solutions to the challenge we face in making sure that apprenticeships are fully inclusive and provide opportunities for everyone that wants to do an apprenticeship. I have to make sure that when I move this, I move that as well. So if I don't, just remind me, please. Thank you. Of course, I think we all appreciate that apprenticeships are key to upskilling and diversifying our workforce. They need to be open and accessible to as many individuals as possible in the workforce. And E&D and inclusion must be integral. We certainly need more providers and employers to embrace diversity and inclusion, and I know that there are good numbers that do that. But I've been at events like this, which have been focused on apprenticeships, and there's been a large focus on the bottom line, the unit costs, the impact of the levy. And when it comes to the kind of equality and diversity aspect, the enthusiasm sometimes diminishes. The last time I spoke to a large audience on apprenticeships with Apprenticeships for England, I think there was 300 people plus in the room from the sector, provider sector. And I spoke, and afterwards there were two people came up to me and asked me about what I'd said and was interested to find out more. That was 2 out of 300. Now, it may have been that I was a very poor speaker, or there was not a lot of interest at that particular time in the E&D agenda. I'd like to think that there is interest because all of you are here today, and that shows me that you are either doing something really positive in your organisations or want to do more. And I think if you are mostly providers, clearly providers yourselves have a really important job, not only as employers, to make sure your workforce is diverse, but the way you can influence and persuade employers to be that much better at tackling and addressing equality and diversity within apprenticeships. Some baseline data, fresh off the government's data set. In terms of age, for the 16 to 24-year-olds, 56% of starts were for that age group. So clearly 40-odd% were older than that. I think there's often a conception with many people that apprenticeships are just young people, but roughly just nearly half are people over 25. And I think we need to just remember that age is important. I have a particular interest in young people in terms of my organisation. For BAME, 10.5%. Of that, the Asian individuals were 4.2%. For African Caribbean, it's about 3-point-something%. But we are at 10.5%. I think the last 2 quarters is showing an increase, probably 11.3%. But that's just the last 2 quarters. So this is the last full year's data. For LDD, around 9.9%. For BME LDD, it's around 5.3%, which is obviously much lower. And I'd just like to say that within LDD, the BME community can often be not on the agenda and not thought about. I think it's important that we do remember within LDD, there's obviously a diversity within that, especially in terms of ethnicity. In terms of gender, 52.8% of starts were females. Tony mentioned the actual targets that we are focused on. This 20% seems to be a magical number for the government, which I don't disagree with. I welcome any targets around diversity and inclusion. But the 20%, the three main areas, as far as I can see, are to increase BAME representation in apprenticeship starts, increase representation of people with learning disabilities and/or disabilities in apprenticeship starts, and in terms of the Department for Transport, of new entrants entering engineering and technical apprenticeships in transport sector to be women to achieve parity with the working population. I think these are important targets, and I'm all about how we help government and providers and employers to try and help achieve that and maybe go beyond. In terms of the public sector workforce, there is a target to have 2.3% of the workforce as apprentices. I thought I'd mention that because it's quite important that where there's more leverage, obviously in the public sector, and that's, I think, a key one to also note. What is the DFE doing and the SFA? I think it seems to be like four main things. The Diversity Champions Network, which I'm sure you'll hear more about today, targeted local area strategy, implementation of the Maynard recommendations, and providers. I was on the Maynard task force, which I found very informative and helpful. And I know that obviously there's a commitment to make sure that the government follows through on that. In terms of each one, the Diversity Champions Network, in summary, because I think it's going to be talked about later, my colleagues in the department tell me that there are plans to expand the cover to more employers. Employers are making pledges to improve access to apprenticeships for BAME individuals, women in STEM, LDD, and other disadvantaged groups. Through the network, the department will be asking employers to raise the profile of their best practice through employer networks and social media. I value the Diversity Champions Network. I think it's really important that we do get employers engaged. And if there are committed individuals in those employer organisations that want to champion this agenda, then I think that's really helpful and important. So I think that's really important and welcome. Targeted local area strategy. I spoke to the individual that's been commissioned by the department to do some thinking around this last week. I like where it's going, but I think the proof will be on the ground. What they're wanting to do, this is around ethnicity primarily, is establish working groups with local partners to develop and agree a strategy for improving BAME representation. They expect this to drive public and private sector employers to do the things you might expect, share best practice in advertising and recruiting apprentices, providing unconscious bias training. Unconscious bias training is obviously a very popular approach to making sure that we can be better employers and better workers and colleagues. I don't know how many of you engage or have commissioned unconscious bias training in your organisations, but I wasn't a fan personally, but now I've seen it and observed the training and spoke to people who've had the training. I can certainly see it does help to open people's awareness of how they communicate and think about colleagues and what they can do in obviously recruitment processes and beyond, and reaching out to diverse people. Educational selection, lowering or removing requirements. And that for me is not about obviously lowering quality, it's removing unnecessary requirements that we don't need for certain roles and certain individuals. And obviously things like diversity on interview panels and to raise awareness. I think one important thing around this agenda is data. If you don't collect the data, how can you measure, gauge how you're improving as an employer and as a provider? And I see, as I've mentioned, I see providers as employers first and foremost, because if you can't demonstrate diversity inclusion, how can we expect employees that you work with and trying to encourage and persuade to do the same. So I've always had a high expectation for providers to be catalysts and exemplars when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And you can look at your own workforce and see where women are, people with learning difficulties and disabilities, BME people, and all the other protected characteristics which are important. So data collection is really important. If this can be done locally, with providers, with colleges, with the job centre, with the councils, I think that'd be a really helpful start. And obviously to raise diversity at a board level is really important. And the government's done quite a bit of work in recent years on FTSE companies and women on boards, and we've seen some progress in terms of the potential of women on boards in top companies in this country. I think it's near 25% now. That is very good. I don't know how many of those women are British nationals, because they could be from all over the world with some of these companies. So I think we need to look at that and the pipeline for British women getting through to company boards in this country. Implementation of the Maynard Task Force recommendations. There are quite a few of the recommendations. The government accepted all the recommendations, and I see my role with my colleagues on the advisory group to make sure that we push the government to really follow through on the recommendations. We do have people with expertise with LDD on the advisory group, and there are people obviously outside of the advisory group who are also trying to make sure the government really does deliver on these recommendations, which are very important. There was a lot of discussion around the maths and English requirements on the task force, and what I took away from that was there are many individuals from the LDD communities who do complete the practical tasks, but they would never get through the maths and English requirements, and that is a barrier. So we need to remove that barrier, and I think the response from the government was, well, we will look at that without lowering quality. And that's what's being done. So I feel and I can see that progress is being made on that. If you feel progress is not being made, please feel free to talk to me afterwards, and I will certainly take messages back to the department. Department plan to speak to stakeholders in the autumn. You're not reminding me, are you, to move with the times? Okay, cool. Sorry about that. So, yes, the department plans to speak to stakeholders in the autumn about the next steps on extending this flexibility and reaching a wider group of people with learning disabilities. I wasn't aware until I did this presentation yesterday that there are pace setters in Kent, Newcastle, Shropshire, Wolverhampton, and all these other areas on the slide there, which are now established and starting to implement many of the key aspects of the Maynard Task Force. I don't know if any of you are involved in those pace setters, but that sounds like a useful step forward. The department is evaluating whether the new apprenticeship funding system is sufficiently supporting apprentices with disabilities as intended. So that review is about to be commissioned shortly, which is helpful. So I think in basic terms, the department has got its kind of focus on LDD and the Maynard recommendations, and I think things are starting to move in the right direction. If it's not fast enough, then, as I said, let me know, and we will certainly try and take it up. Providers, I've said much of this, but I wanted to kind of recognise providers as a key part of the strategy in terms of, as I said, raising awareness, supporting employers, and helping to collect diversity data. We did some message testing with employers in London last year through YouGov about diversity, and they spoke to around 25 SMEs in London from different sectors. And I sat and observed one of them through a screen. And they were asked about diversity and what they felt that meant to them as employers. And interestingly, they readily said gender, disability, skills diversity. They had to be prompted to talk about ethnicity as an aspect of diversity, which was disappointing to me, bearing in mind London is 43% BME, and that we've got 25 employers from London who don't recognise ethnicity in diversity. So that tells me that whatever we've been doing for the last 30 years, and equality legislation, and making the business case and the moral case, it's still not hitting home to many companies in the UK on a practical level, and we need to address that. The good thing was, they all came out in the evening to contribute to this focus group, so clearly they've got an interest in wanting to know more and do more. But I think we can't be complacent, is what I'm saying, about how we engage with employers. Is this enough? I asked myself yesterday. It's a start, isn't it, in terms of what the government is doing, and it must be built on. We need everyone to drive improvements. That is about leadership. It's about commitment. It's about resources, of course. It's about everyone in this room, I think, working with colleagues, encouraging, challenging where necessary, but constructively, and finding ways forward to engage and reach wider individuals from more diverse backgrounds. Protected characteristics are all important in terms of the Equality Act. I care about all individuals getting on in life. I come from a working class background in Walsall, not too far from Coventry. I went to Warwick University. I left school with no qualifications. Most of my peers were white working class individuals. Many left school with nothing, but at least they got a job, often with their parents in whatever roles they did. I didn't have that route in through my lone parent family, so I had to go to college and do that kind of adult learning route, which is obviously very helpful to people like me who left school with nothing. So I think it is about looking at everyone and not missing out people. We know that there is an issue with white working class boys in terms of GCSE attainment. I work in a lot of schools, and I say to the staff, we're targeting young BAME individuals because they're lagging behind on GCSEs, or they've got 4 times higher exclusion rates, blah, blah, blah. They will say to me, yes, that is a problem in this school. We do have too many young black boys in exclusion units and all the rest of it. But we also have a problem with white working class boys. But no one is addressing their issues. So I said recently, does anyone actually come in and offer to do anything for those white working class boys? And they said no. And I must admit, all my years in the charity sector, 30 odd years, I don't meet many charities focusing on white working class boys and education attainment. So if there's anyone out there that wants to work with my organisation to see what we can do, that would be really helpful. So it is important that we look at all young people in particular where we're trying to improve things, especially in the workplace, but also in terms of GCSE attainment. Flexibility, I wanted to mention this because I do go to a lot of events and listen to people about what their concerns are. And a number of women organisations have talked to me about part-time apprenticeships. And as far as I understand, it is technically possible to do a part-time apprenticeship. We have many women doing part-time work, but they cannot access part-time apprenticeships. And I can appreciate this practicalities. You know better than me, you'll be providers. But I think in terms of our workforce, Brexit, we must have a more flexible apprenticeship framework that can provide part-time apprenticeships more readily to people that want to do it. So I wouldn't like to lose that off the agenda, and I will certainly try to be taking that forward through the advisory group and with ministers when I get the opportunity. It's not promoted, and it should be, and we can all play a part in that, I hope. My time is probably running out, and I don't like running over time, but I want to mention we're involved in some practical projects. They're on our website, but the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, we're involved in supporting 4 organisations, doing some test pilots. One of them is Bradford City Council, who are working with textile companies, Keighley College, an Asian women's group. They're trying to get more Asian women into the textile sector in Bradford. And the college hosted a round table with 15 employers from the textile sector locally, all of whom were white-owned, but had virtually no Asian women in a predominantly Asian women community. So the employers, good thing they came out. They engaged in a conversation about how they recruit, why they think they can't reach Asian women, and they engaged in a practical solution with the college, with the council, and with an Asian women's group. They now have a textile academy. They're getting more women coming forward to appreciate that textile is high-tech. There are better opportunities for with skilled prospects. So it's not just low skill, low pay. And these companies are engaging. And I think that's really good to see companies engaging with a provider, in this case a college, and the community, and finding a practical solution to get more diversity in their companies. They appreciate, with Brexit, and some of these companies employ 70% European migrants in their companies, they think that's going to change, so they're now appreciating they need to reach the local people. And in this case, many of the local people are Asian communities in that local area. Trust for London City Bridge Trust, moving on up. We've been working for 2 years, 6 providers to try and get 500 young black men into work. It's been hard going. We've got about 300 into work. But we've realised that employers do not like talking about young black men. They will not come to a meeting to talk about young black men in a college, in a job centre, or anywhere. We've had some recent success with construction companies, and we work with the tech sector, and we want to work with the city in London. But it's hard going. I do not know why employers do not like talking about young black men, but that is what we've found over 2 years. Thank you for listening. Have a really positive day. There's my website. I'll be around till lunchtime today. We can solve this problem. It doesn't happen overnight, but with your energy and desire, I'm sure we can improve the numbers and make sure all our companies are that much better and more productive. Thanks.
Think apprenticeship. Think pathway.